It was Boxing Day and we were docked in St. Martin. I had arranged for the Spaniard to meet me at my cabin. My pal from home, Ginge, was on board for the Christmas cruise, and he looked worse for wear. I know that Ginge only had 3 hours of sleep. I know this because I only had 1 hour of sleep, as the Rossum bastard snores like a cunt. Ginge was staying in my cabin on the top bunk. It was 8 a.m, an ungodly hour for my line of work, and a filthy lack of sleep hangover did not help matters one bit. I waded through the pile of empties that were scattered over the floor, tripped up and stubbed my toe on the bulkhead. I guess I was still pissed from the night before. I had a root around in my secret stash and found a multi-pack of Red Bull. "Here, nick this, you fucker," I said as I lobbed a tin of Billy at Ginge. With a thud, the can smacked Ginge in the balls. This was purely accidental, but at least it kept the fucker awake. There was a knock on the door. As I opened the door, I hear, "Hey, Paulie," as it was the Spaniard's Portuguese love interest, along with the Spaniard. Neither of them looked as wretched as Ginger and I, but looks can be deceiving. I offered everyone a tin of Red Bull, as we were going to need it. Neither Ginger nor Portuguese knew the surprise that the Spaniard and I had planned. The four of us marched off the ship, out of the port, and turned right. Portuguese had been to St. Martin before, but she had never ventured rights before. She had only gone left into town. Within 10 minutes we were at our destination. It was a massive hire garage. Ginger and Portuguese were told to wait outside, while the Spaniard and I doubts with what we had planned. The Spaniard and I went up to the counter and introduced ourselves to the manager. "Hi there, we emailed a reservation for today under the name of Collis." The manager looked through his paperwork. "Ah, yeah, you've already paid. If you hand me your ship's IDs for security and sign the paperwork, then they are all yours. Just remember to return them with a minimum of a quarter of a tank." The Spaniard and I handed over our ship's IDs, signed the forms, and he let us loose. He didn't even check if we had driver's licenses. I knew the Spaniard did, but not me. I've never held a license in my life. My only form of transportation back home was a push bike, and now I was trusted on a foreign road and I was completely wasted from the night before. The Spaniard and I pulled up alongside Ginge and Portuguese on our 150cc quad bikes. Ginge jumped on the back of my bike, as did Portuguese with the Spaniard. The Spaniard took the lead, as this was the first time I'd ever driven anything with an engine. The controls are easy, just push it into high or low gear and turn the throttle on the handlebars. What could go wrong? I stalled it. I couldn't believe it. I fucking stalled it. Anyways, I tried again and the quad bike jumped back to life. I looked at the speedometer and I was cruising at 30 miles an hour. Not bad. I finally caught up with a Spaniard. The fucker had powered it to a petrol station and had already filled the tank with juice. I parked up at a pump and loaded my tank. $8 it cost to fill up. Not bad going. We're about to set off and I offered Ginge to drive. He looked at me and his face was still full of death from the night before. There's no chance this cunt was going to be able to drive for quite a few hours. The Spaniard took the lead once more and we set off. We approached the roundabout. That was the main one that would take you to Philipsburg town centre, to the residential area or towards the airport and French side of the island. The Spaniard took the second exit towards the French side. There were 2 cars between the Spaniard and myself as he entered the roundabout. This was going to be a tricky one for me. I was still on the British rules of the road and kept looking in the wrong direction, the angry beeps of encouragement coming from behind me. I got my shit together, found a window of opportunity and crossed the roundabout. There was no sign of the Spaniard. I looked at the speedometer and saw I was only going 50 miles an hour. Shit, I bellowed. I pulled the throttle back and my speed increased. I finally managed to make it to 60 miles an hour. Then I passed the Spaniard. He was pulled over outside a random bar. I slowed down and looked over my shoulder and it was clear. I looked in front and it was clear, and I did a U-turn and found my way back to the bar. I pulled in and was open to ridicule from the Spaniard. "Hey man, my nan drives faster than you," he said as he passed me a beer. "God, I needed that," I said. The stabby hangover headache from behind the eyes had begun to raise its head. I needed this to be able to keep me on the road. I passed the beer to Ginge and he point blankly refused it. He was still really pale, and that was saying something, as being a ginger he was really pasty as fuck anyways. My equilibrium had returned. I was still way over the limit. If I got pulled over and given a breathalyzer test, it would explode the minute I started to blow into it. I jumped back onto the quad bike and once again the Spaniard took the lead. We pelted it along this long and slightly bumpy road till we came across a nice deserted stretch of sandy beach. The Spaniard bumped off the road and I followed. Seawater and sand were spewing everywhere. It was fortunate that I was wearing sunglasses as chunks of wet sand were peppering my face. Had I had my mouth open, I would have needed to go on a sand-free diet by the end of the day. "Oh, you cunt," I shouted back at Ginge. "You still awake?" I yelled as I started to do some donuts in the sand. I felt a sharp tug on my back, so I stopped, and Ginge fell off the bike and began to throw up. I laughed my ass off as he was trying to retch up what was no longer there from the night before. I stopped the engine and tended to my childhood friend. The Spaniard at this point realised we were nowhere near him. He did a U-turn and bombed it back towards Ginge and myself. He killed his engine and both the Spaniard and the Portuguese jumped off. While Ginge was recovering, both the Spaniard and the Portuguese stripped off to the swimwear and took a dunk in the deep turquoise water. I lit a cigarette but offered Ginge absolutely no words of encouragement. Ginge at this point fell asleep, so I grabbed the Spaniard's t-shirt and covered Ginge's face. I just knew he wouldn't forgive me for the rest of the trip if he became lobster-fired. While Ginge was sleeping and the two continentals were frolicking around in the surf, I took the opportunity to have a mini posing and selfie session while I was sat on the quad bike. At one point I even took my t-shirt off and posed with my guns hanging out. The continentals eventually came back to the bikes. It wouldn't be long until the sun dried them off. That was one of my favourite things about being in the Caribbean. You didn't really need to bring a towel as the sun did the work for you. It was time to move on. I nudged Ginge with my flip-flop and eventually he came around. He definitely looked better now he had a bit more rest. I offered him the quad bike but once again he turned it down. I fired up the engine and waited for the Spaniard to start his bike up. Nothing happened. The Spaniard's engine wouldn't turn over. I could hear him yelling Spanish aggressively at the quad bike. I could only assume he was swearing hard at it. I drove my bike closer to the Continentals. "It won't fucking turn over, man," he said. "What the fuck are we gonna do?" I had to think. I lit a cigarette and had a look around. All three of us blokes had belts on. "Right, that was part of the solution." "Right," I said. "We interlink our belts and bodge a tow rope. I drag your bike back onto the road. We're at the bottom of a long but short hill. I drag your bike to the top. We turn your bike around and I push your bike fast enough to get your alternator working so you can turn over your engine." "Sounds good," said the Spaniard. We all removed our belts so our trousers and shorts were hanging around our asses. I looped my belt through the front grille of my quad bike and linked my belt to the Ginger's belt. The Spaniard looped his belt through the front grille and then linked to Ginger's belt. I fired up my engine and put my bike in reverse. I took this slowly to test the strain. It worked. I managed to get the Spaniard's bike back onto the road and I slowly started to reverse up the hill. Then ping! For fuck's sake, my belt snapped and the Spaniard's bike began to roll down the hill. Both the Continentals and Ginger were fortunately still down the hill and I managed to catch the quad bike. I guess we'll have to go to plan B. I drove back down the hill. Only having two belts, we just didn't have enough length. "Fuck's sake," I said. "Any ideas?" The Spaniard had an idea. "Portuguese, you are by far the lightest. If you jump on my quad bike, it might be light enough for Paul to push it uphill and you can steer," said the Spaniard. It was all we had, so we gave it a try. I took a bit of a run up and I drove my bike into the back end of Portuguese's bike. We were now moving. Slowly but surely we were going in the right direction. It took about 5 minutes to get both quad bikes to the top. Once there, I left my quad bike running idle as I pushed Portuguese and her quad bike to the centre of the road. I jumped on my quad bike and positioned it bumper to bumper with Portuguese's quad. I revved my engine a few times, released my brake and shunted forward. I opened up the throttle and pushed the other quad bike full pelt. Portuguese attempted to turn over the engine, it spluttered and died. She did it again, and once more it spluttered and died. We were running out of road. I could see a bend approaching. It was now or never. If Portuguese failed to turn the engine over this time, I would have to abort and we would need to think of a plan C. Portuguese tried again and the engine came to life. I slowed down and did a U-turn back to Ginge and the Spaniard. Portuguese carried on driving, then returned to where we were 10 minutes later. She pulled up and left the quad bike running idle. The Spaniard jumped on the back, as did Ginge onto my quad, and we began pelting it towards Airport Beach, or as the locals called it, Maho Beach. As we approached the beach, there was a bit of a traffic jam. The Spaniard jumped off the quad and had walked down to see what was going on. He returned a few minutes later. "The barriers are down. I think a jumbo's about to take off," he said with a smile on his face. I looked over my shoulder and noticed an access point towards the beachfront. I did a very embarrassing 12-point turn to get onto the other side of the road and bumped onto the sand. Portuguese followed, doing a very graceful U-turn. we could see a line of people making their way to the airport perimeter fence. This army of people wearing bikinis and swim shorts just clung to the fence as tight as they could, waiting in expectation of what was about to happen. The beach was full of the brave, but not brave enough to go to the fence, standing and looking at this 747 taxiing itself to the runway. It was fortunate our quad bikes were not in the direct path of inevitability, as I just knew what would happen. "If you're not wearing your sunglasses now would be a good time, guys," I said as the siren sounded. There's a long deep silence from the surrounding area. You can feel the anticipation of everyone in the area. The 747 began to power up its powerful engines. They started off quiet, then before you knew it, the engines grew louder and louder and the plane began to move along the runway. With an almighty power, the engines hit full power, sending a shockwave towards the beach as this bastard plane took off. The people that were holding onto the perimeter fence were holding on for dear life as the shockwave took them off their feet. One girl let go and was flung into a concrete slab that was separating the beach from the road. The group of the not so brave were sent flying onto their asses as though they were pins in a bowling alley. Hats, clothes and iPads and phones were flung into the sea, never to be returned by the great god Poseidon. Drinks were no longer drinkable as they were engulfed by a wave of sand. The four of us were just laughing at all this unprepared bunch of cunts, though I did feel slightly bad about the stupid girl that was launched into the concrete slab. Well, at the end of the day, it was her fault. If people are going to take on a shockwave of a 747, then they only have themselves to blame if they end up in a hospital. Ginge took a walk without saying anything. He was in a semi-awake caveman state. This was a good sign as he was nearly alive. The Spaniard looked at his fuel gauge. He was on just over a quarter of a tank. This wasn't good. If we stopped to refuel, we might not get his engine to turn over again. I looked at my fuel gauge. It was just under half a tank. Shit, the Continentals had just burnt too much fuel, keeping the bike idle. We were going to have to head back to avoid running out of fuel. Ginge returned and had a bucket of beer. I looked at the Spaniard who looked back at me. "Dude," I said to Ginge, "we've got to cane these, then head back or the Spaniard's not going to have enough fuel to get back." Ginge passed out the bottles and all four of us chugged back a bottle of Carib each. Then we necked the final bottle. I was feeling good, better than good. I was like Popeye had just chugged his tin of spinach. I lit a cigarette and then paddled back towards the port.